Hello and welcome to another A-Tippling Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. I'm going to go through a video that I was watching this morning, an interaction between Alex O'Connor, used to be known as Cosmic Skeptic, and Dinesh D'Souza, a bit of a problematic Christian apologist. I remember once actually having a bit of an email debate with Dinesh D'Souza where he was calling into question, modern atrocities in terms of atheistic regimes, such as the whole Hitler, Pol Pot, and Stalin, and that these were all atheists, and therefore atheism leads to genocide and atrocity. And I called him out on loads of assumptions he was making, not least obviously the idea that Hitler was some kind of atheist, which is a highly controversial conclusion. But I called him out on needing to make a distinction between intention and actuality. And if you look at more recent genocides, the intention was identical to genocides from 500 years ago, but the tools with which you can do that, gas chambers, mass transportation in trains, weapons of mass destruction, all these kinds of things mean that you can kill people much more easily and all in one fell swoop type thing, in a way that you were less able to in times gone past. And so when you are comparing atrocities, I mean, it's a pretty macabre subject, you need to be careful of these different ideas, and he wasn't anyway. We had this argument online on by email, and I confess to winning that argument anyway. Whatever, but we have a really interesting interaction here that I haven't seen the whole debate, and I'd like to, and it does get cut off, and I don't know where they take it from here, but I'd like to add to some things that Alex O'Connor was saying in this, because I think there were a couple of points that also needed to be made. But it's brilliant. Alex O'Connor is such a fantastic thinker, and he's also just incredibly calm. He's a really good debater because he's both meticulous, but also can catch you off guard with incisive observations and arguments, and isn't sort of he's not a rambunctious sort of person. He's not bombastic. He's just calm and incisive. Anyway, let's listen to the argument. I'm going to react to certain elements of it as we go.
We can find the ruins of ancient cities. Okay, that's not too extraordinary to me. I have no problem saying that the people who wrote these texts knew where these places were.
Okay,
with exact precision. And in fact, notice what's happening. Notice what's happening, in my view. What's happening is that the Bible is a historical text and a scientific text when it needs to be, and it's not one when you don't want it to be. So when I said a moment ago, here's a relatively mundane historical fact about the Gospels, you said, well, the fact that some mundane historical fact should undermine Christianity is ludicrous. But now you're telling me that a mundane historical fact is enough to buttress Christianity. I don't think you can have your cake and eat it too in that case.
Let's just think a little bit about this to give you the context of what they're talking about. It's the idea that if there are certain historical markers in a text, it means that the text is true. I've often used the Arthur Conan Doyle example, the analogy that Arthur Conan Doyle writes about Sherlock Holmes, sets that within the context of London as a story, and you have historical markers. I don't know. Queen Victoria was mentioned, this person was mentioned, that person was mentioned, but the fiction is set within that historical context. Now, just because we know that Queen Victoria existed and that London existed and Arthur Conan Doyle mentions this place and that person and that real life event, it doesn't mean that the story of Sherlock Holmes is factually true. It's a fiction set within a historical narrative. Or historical context, and that is kind of what's going on here. But it's really interesting that Alex O'Connor, prior to the start of this excerpt, Alex O'Connor points out that actually Dinesh D'Souza is using double standards, because he's saying, on the one hand, when it's convenient, this historical marker shows that it's true, and on the other hand, the kind of antithesis is just when it's convenient.
I'm not trying to have my cake and eat it too. I'm simply saying that if somebody gives a true account of events complete with small details that are incidental to the narrative. The Bible refers to very much.
Notice he's smuggled in. This is a circular argument. He's started with the assumption that it's a true story, but that, of course, is what we're trying to find out.
I'm not trying to have my cake and eat it too. I'm simply saying that if somebody gives a true account of events, complete with small details that are incidental to the narrative, the Bible refers to very minor figures at times. Let's take, for example, Caiaphas. Caiaphas is one of the two high priests who is present at Jesus' trial. We don't even know his first name. He's mentioned as Caiaphas. The historian Josephus calls him Josephus Caiaphas. And that is the only indication from Josephus, and only one source, and a source writing a little later, of what this guy's name even was. And until recently, a few decades ago, there was absolutely no corroboration that there was ever a guy even named Caiaphas. Except now, not only do we have inscriptions with his name, we actually have his bones.
But Dinesh, what does this matter?
Okay, so what I'm getting at is,
what does this matter? Exactly. It's the Arthur Conan Doyle approach, which is, okay, the account mentions a real person. Do we have any idea that was factual? That actually that person was involved in this? Or is he picking just a famous member of the Sanhedrin or whatever it was who people would have known about and then brings him into the story?
What does this matter?
Because we also know that Pontius Pilate existed, right? But did he let Barabbas off and condemn Jesus in a way that had never happened before? You know, I write about this in my book, The Resurrection: A Critical Examination. And in fact, you can see the cover just up there. So it doesn't at all, in my opinion, have any power in proving the claims to have been factual, true.
To the question.
why does it matter?
Why does this matter?
Because if somebody is giving a true account of events, you know, a guy comes running into this room and he goes, "Guess what? I've just witnessed a murder." He's going to give us a lot of accounts and a lot of detail, right? Now,
look, if somebody was trying to claim that Moses parted the Red Sea, and I said, well, how could you possibly know that's the case? And you said, well, look, we didn't have any evidence that a guy called Moses existed, but we've discovered this rock where someone wrote Moses was here.
No.
Great,
no,
okay, we know Moses existed, and maybe we know where he existed, but the actual events, the stories that are attributed to these characters are in no way supported by anything that you're saying. And that's the important thing. I think that's what people are interested in.
That is the important thing. The stories attributed to Caiaphas, to Jesus, and we don't know that Jesus existed, or you know, you go from mythicism to historicism, but even with the historicism, my position is that Jesus existed, but everything that's written about him in the Gospels is false. Like some human being by the name of Jesus, an itinerant preacher, probably existed and then had all sorts of stories attributed to him that were factually untrue. It is, you know, Dinesh D'Souza is making some huge jumps here.
I doubt that anybody in this room, and they can make themselves known if they're here, I don't think anybody in this room either thinks that it's important or is troubled in their skepticism by the existence of these people and the real existence of the places that are described in the Old Testament.
right, and neither do I think that a single Christian believer in the world would be shaken by anything that you've said today. So let's really try to meet in the middle on the stuff that really matters. And I think what we're really saying, when you mentioned the parting of the Red Sea, to me, it's like, now we're talking. Because we're talking about...
These are different.
These are categorically different types of events.
I mean what you just said, these are different because people are troubled by what I...
What I really like about Alex O'Connor, and this is something that if I was in the same situation I would do, I like to think, which is, hang on, mate. Stop. You've just said something and straight away I disagree with that. So the problem is we let people go on and on and on, and this looks like interruption quite often, but it needs to happen. It's like, I'm not going to let you go on, because if you're basing your eventual conclusion on all this framework of assumptions and claims that you're making, if I don't disabuse you of the notion that this is true down here, then you will end up here, and then we'll be ending up arguing about this. But we need to argue about what you're starting with, and you've just said something which is not true, so I've got to call you out on that straight away before I allow you to go further. And that's a really important I think mechanic to debating and arguing, but unfortunately it does sound like interrupting all the time, because you're like, no, you can't go on, we need to bottom this out. And I like the way that Alex O'Connor does that.
I say, and they're not troubled by what you say, because for an atheist to say that Hezekiah existed doesn't mean they can't be an atheist. For a Christian to say that Jesus didn't historically rise from the dead means that they're not a Christian.
Correct.
So these are different. They're asymmetrical.
They're asymmetrical. So let's pick up the.
So it matters. It matters when the historical elements are wrong, in terms of our grand conclusion. For the Christian, it matters when the history gets it wrong. For the atheist, it doesn't matter when the history gets it right.
What I'm saying is that if some.
And I would qualify that slightly. So he mentioned, Jesus rises from the dead. If that was right, then obviously that does matter to the atheist. But in terms of the general historical claims about Hezekiah existed here and this person and that person, the existence of these people, these historical figures, that are mentioned in the Bible, does not prove the Bible, is what he's saying. But actually, if we can find out they didn't exist, then it disproves the Bible. So actually, there is a really important asymmetry there that Alex O'Connor is absolutely right to point out.
If someone gives a true account of events, it is normal for the accounts to vary, to differ, in some cases to have minor contradictions. Sure. The real question is did the thing that's being described actually happen?
Okay, so
let's turn to that.
Do you think, for example, that the slaughter of the Amalekites that I mentioned before actually happened?
Probably, of course.
And if that happened, I mean, we haven't spoken about the concept of moral truth. I'd like to get the time to do so.
We can come to that, but let's stay with what I think you were about to get to, which I think is the heart of the matter that we haven't even gotten to, and that's this: the Bible is where the Bible is the most unbelievable is in its account of astounding and miraculous events.
Sure.
Right? Healings. Let's take the most outrageous event of all, which is, let's just say, bringing a guy back from the dead.
Yeah.
Presented in the Bible as a miracle.
Talking about Lazarus here, rather than
I'm talking here about Lazarus, yes. Lazarus, perfect. Now, for a Christian would say this. A, the Bible doesn't try to prove it, it simply asserts it. In fact, it presents it as a truth of revelation, if you will. God revealed this. It's a miracle, which is to say that it is not something that happens within the seeming known laws of nature, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the question really here is, are these kinds of miracles possible? If you say, are they implausible, or are they rare, or is it difficult to believe, the Christian is like right with you.
I think the question is, did they happen?
Did they happen, right? Here's where the Christian and the atheist are on common ground, because the Christian and the atheist would both say that based upon ordinary experience, it can't happen.
Sure.
Because otherwise it wouldn't be a miracle.
So what evidence might we have to suggest that these miraculous events as described in the Gospels did happen?
I'm saying that because the miraculous events, the Christian would simply say, if God exists, miracles are obviously possible.
Sure, I agree.
The atheist has a higher burden. And
this is where it gets a little bit funky, and actually you can talk about Bayesian probability analysis and background evidence. Now, I wrote an article on this some time back, the circularity of believing the miracles of the New Testament, because what happens is, and if I've been there, this is where I would have taken the argument. But Alex O'Connor goes in a different direction, which is fascinating. We're going to come to that in a second. But this idea of circularity is that, right, so the Christian says, because I believe in God, I therefore see miracles as possible, conceptually possible, because I believe in God. So we have a chicken and the egg situation here. And this is what I call a circularity, because you start with, I believe in God, and therefore miracles are possible. But then what happens is miracles happen, they are written into the New Testament, and it is the miracles in the New Testament that lead to my belief in God, right? Like you're not born believing just in this abstract sense that there is a God that exists and can do miracles, right? So you're getting that from somewhere. So you're taking that, extracting that kind of knowledge out of the New Testament or the Bible to justify your belief in God. But then you're saying, I find these miracles more plausible because I believe in God. But hang on, you're using these miracles as evidence for God, and then you're using God as evidence for, or as conceptual possibility for miracles happening. And there's a circle. And that, I would say that is just unsound. Now, I know there's Munchausen's trilemma, so there are only three ways of grounding anything: a self-evident truth, a circle, or an infinite regress. And all of them are somewhat problematic, right, to different degrees. But I think there is definitely an issue with the grounding of this circular argument, because actually one is deferring to the other, or is contingent on the other, and that is contingent on the former. And you've got an issue. So I would have called Dinesh D'Souza out on that, because that is problematic, because he talks about, well, your background knowledge is that or my background knowledge as a Christian, he would say, is that I think miracles are automatically plausible. And then miracles prove my God.
Miracles are obviously possible.
Sure, I agree.
The atheist has a higher burden. And that is, the atheist has to say that whether or not God exists, which is not the topic of our debate here, miracles are impossible. Because if they're possible...
They don't have to say that.
You don't have to say that?
No, of course they don't have to say that.
You don't have to say that. You say it is possible for a man to be raised from the dead.
I can say that that's possible without thereby...
But you're saying, but this particular one didn't happen, but the event is possible.
Without thereby in any way telling us anything about whether it happened as reported to
us. Is it possible is it possible for the Red Sea to be parted?
Sure, why not?
It is.
Okay.
Okay.
Is it possible for But what does that do for us? Is it possible that Muhammad flew to heaven on a winged horse?
Okay, so here's our problem.
Well, hold on. Yes or no?
Yes, of course it's possible.
Of course it's possible. So that means that the miraculous events as described in Islam, you've got such a higher burden of proof than the Muslim does if you're having a debate with a Muslim.
Wow, and he's done in there. He said, I will grant you that the Red Sea can be parted. I could grant you that a person can be resurrected, in the same way that you would have to grant that it's possible for Muhammad to have flown on a winged horse, etc., etc. And okay, now do you see the problem that you might have as a burden of proof?
But
because you have to say that's impossible.
I am not trying to prove the veracity of this or that miracle. I freely admit that I can't do that.
I'm not trying to prove the veracity of this
but
or
you
that
can't
miracle.
disprove it either.
No, of course I can't disprove it.
Exactly.
But that's not my task yet. That's like me saying, I think that, I don't know, to take a Shakespearean example, I think that, spoiler alert,
Well, we don't need a Shakespearean example.
Romeo took the poison.
Let's take an actual...
And if you said, well, hold on, how do you know that actually happened? And I said, well, you can't prove that it didn't.
Well, let's pick an actual example that pertains to Christianity. Let's talk about something I raised
earlier. Trying to prove a negative. And famously a bit of an issue.
Earlier.
We've got about 5 minutes before Q&A,
okay.
by the way.
Do you believe that there is life after death?
I don't know.
You don't have no idea?
Yeah, I'm agnostic on that.
So if I say that there's life after death, am I being unreasonable?
I don't think so.
Not at all.
It depends on your reasons.
Now, they don't really go into this because actually he says, it's reasonable. So Alex O'Connor grants that that's reasonable, but then he makes reference to it depends what your reasons are. And the reality is that it's almost always unreasonable. So it could be reasonable if you had good reasons to believe that. But if we were to sit down and talk about it, we would find out that your reasons were not good enough. And so actually it's unreasonable. So there is a little bit of nuance here that could be mistaken for Alex granting Dinesh D'Souza an awful lot more.
It depends on my reasons, but what I'm saying is if I were to tell you that there is no empirical way to prove this one way or the other, my faith, let's say, that there's life after death is just as reasonable as someone who says there isn't.
No. So I would disagree there because it becomes about probability. Everyone has a bit of faith. I've talked about this a number of times previously. We have faith that we aren't a brain in a vat, that we're not living in a matrix, right? We can't prove or disprove that. And then it comes down to sort of Cartesian epistemological claims. So Descartes would say the only thing that we can know indubitably 100% is that we exist, or whatever we is, the thinking entity exists. The experiencing entity exists by experiencing. Axiomatically that is true. And in order to doubt that I exist, I have to exist to do the doubting. But past that, everything is a probability. So what this comes down to is that, well, your claims about a miracle happening in the Bible is a probability assessment. I think that it's not impossible. It's not that I'm 100% sure that it didn't happen, because the only thing I can say is 100% sure I'm 100% sure is true is that I exist, right? So everything is a probability assessment. I just think it's 99.9999%. I'm 99.999% sure that did not happen. And we just have a very different probability analysis. You think it's more probable because you've plugged into your probability analysis is where it gets a bit Bayesian, where you'll have a background knowledge that God exists. But the problem is that was circular, like we said earlier. So if you start with that, then it becomes more probable that a miracle has happened. But then you use that the conclusion that miracles happen to plug into your background knowledge that God exists. And we've got a problem here, D'Souza. That is your issue. And so it's a probability evaluation that I think the atheist is far more justified in believing that such miracles didn't happen and haven't happened.
Sure, it depends on what the reasons that are given are, of course, but sure. That's...
We're talking about the reasons that are actually available. Not the person who's giving a reason may give the best or not the best reason.
It's pedantic, but I'm happy to say yes. I just want to be careful what I say, because people might get the wrong impression of my beliefs. But yeah, sure. I mean, sure. We've got two people. One says life after death. One says not. They're both just as reasonable as each other.
They're both just as reasonable.
Sure. That could
okay.
Be
Excellent. Okay. Good.
And I think he's doing that not because he thinks they are equally reasonable, but because, for the sake of argument, let's assume that and see where this goes.
I wanted to clarify that point particularly because
what's this got to do with the truth of the Bible?
Well, all I am saying is that the claims of miracles, you and I are not going to be in a position to go back and see whether or not Jesus raised a man from the dead.
Well,
right?
It's not all you say. It's not all you're saying.
Well, actually, that's not quite true either, because we are able to affect our probability evaluation. In fact, that's exactly what I did do in my book, The Resurrection, A Critical Examination. Literally, that was a job, which is to say that we can't prove this either way, but how can we affect the probability evaluation? And I actually use Bayesian reasoning in there, or intuitively use it and reference it. But there are all sorts of indicators from the Bible and from our known history that will affect the probability of whether those claims are true. And then you look at the contradictions and say, actually, those contradictions are really problematic. So at least some of these claims are untrue, possibly all of them, and so on and so forth. And you go through and you say, well, actually, that's not the burial practices. So, this doesn't accord with history. And actually, this wasn't what the Jewish customs were, and so on and so forth. So I disagree with Dinesh D'Souza that there's some kind of 50-50. So neither of us can prove it or disprove it. So, it's equally reasonable type thing. No.
The Christian is perfectly willing to take that on faith.
You think that did happen, and you're taking it on faith, and that's fine.
Yes.
More power to you. And in fact, I envy your ability to believe things despite what
well, don't you take a lot of things on faith?
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
Plenty of things on faith.
Yeah, all the time.
So all the things that you take on faith are things that you think are not unreasonable, but the things that Christians take on faith are to you unreasonable because they can't be corroborated with historical evidence.
Is that what I said? I don't remember saying that.
So are the Christian...
Which is really interesting. So Dinesh D'Souza isn't quite... They're sort of talking cross purposes here. I assume, and it depends how you define faith. So faith is a tricky concept. It seems that Alex O'Connor is talking about faith is, assent to a proposition absent of evidence. But it depends how much evidence you are absent there as to how reasonable it is to have faith in something. So, for example, he says, I do things on faith all the time, which is, so for example, I believe that I'm not a brain in a vat, and I believe I'm not in the Matrix, right? So that is faith. I can't prove it, but I've got no reason to believe that I am, and I think on balance, there's a bit of... So I've often talked previously about how if you talk about assent to a proposition, belief in something being true or whatever, you fill your mug up. So hit up here, this is my vessel of belief, if you like, and you fill it up with evidence, and then ideally you have as much evidence as possible, and then you are totally justified in your belief. But if you've only got, say, 60% evidence, then you've kind of got 40% faith, which you could talk about. Faith might actually look something like a probability assessment, which is like, okay, I'm going to cross this busy road, right, with my eyes closed. I'm not going to look either way. I have faith that I'm going to live to get to the other side. I'm going to walk across a motorway. You're like, okay, what's the evidence that, that's going to be an awful lot of faith. And actually, I'm not justified in having that faith. Like, that is ridiculous, really. Whereas if I do that, my road out there, which is very quiet, and there are very rarely cars that go past, and close my eyes and do that, I've got, how much evidence that I've got. Well, actually, there is some evidence to suggest, but it is looking on prior probabilities, so evidence from that, and looking at, well, how often do cars drive past, and how quickly do they go? Are they likely to see me? And if and so I've got faith that I will get across there. But actually, that understanding of faith is a kind of intuition based on prior probabilities and probability assessments. And so it really does depend. The point being, it depends how you define faith here. And I think they would have to bottom that out before having this part of the discussion be more meaningful.
Beliefs on faith just as reasonable as everything that you believe on faith.
It can be, depending on the reasons. But the veracity of the gospel accounts and the Old Testament prophecy, I think, is unreasonable to believe in. Not life after death, that's fine, you can believe that. Not like, a man called Jesus rose from the dead, fine. But the idea that the Bible comports with reality either in mythological sense, in an allegorical sense, in a moral sense, or in the sense of historicity.
Let's talk about the moral sense, since you raised it, and we'll just talk about it briefly.
I want to make sure we've got time for Q&A. But look, I can reread the text if you like.
And this is where we get on to really what I wanted to talk about this video. So there's an awful lot of preamble, but interesting, hopefully. And this is where we get to the meat of the matter.
The Amalekites...
Well, let's not talk about the Amalekites, in part because here's the problem. For most Christians, the Old Testament is different than the New and is seen through the light of the New. So
but if
you want to go to, Dennis Prager, who has written about this from a Jewish perspective, has written about the Deuteronomy, the Book of Kings, the Amalekites.
Sure, we can bring him out
what he considers
later,
to be the justifiable massacre of the Canaanites. I don't really want to go there because...
Well, I know why you don't want to go there.
Well, the reason I don't want to go there, the Old Testament is...
This is brilliant. So, we can talk about the Amalekites, but Dennis Prager, he's written a book on that, and this is what William Lane Craig used to do. He said Paul Copan's written a book on Old Testament stuff, and he's got a moral monster. Well, go and read his stuff. I'm not going to deal with that. Why don't you want to deal with it? Because it's deeply uncomfortable, and you will find that most Christians will fall on the Old Testament if they're pressed on it. And that's why they kind of defer to the New Testament, because the Old Testament was so problematic. They say, well, the New Testament is this new covenant, this new agreement with God's chosen people through Jesus as God incarnate in human form, and it kind of supersedes the Old Testament. Now, that is what Dinesh D'Souza appears to want to do here in the form of a progressive revelation. So you have the kind of, it's a bit crappy over here, and then everything gets better and better and better through the New Testament to Jesus, so on and so forth.
The Old Testament is full of horrific massacres.
Yes, and
that is hold on.
Massacres which are ordained.
Massacres which appear to be ordained by Yahweh directly. Sure. Agreed.
So, watch out for the word switches there. So, that are ordained by God, and then to get himself off the hook, D'Souza goes, that appear to be ordained by Yahweh. So this is now no longer God, even though Yahweh is God, as everyone would understand it. But he's just doing a little bit of a psychological switch there. So it's like a different iteration of God, and it's like a less morally upstanding version of God. It's Yahweh. No, it's God. It's ordained by God. Like that's the obvious reading of the Bible.
And
why are you saying Yahweh instead of God? Why are you
brilliant?
Because trying to distance yourself from the God of the Old Testament.
I missed this a lot because I've watched this very quickly through this morning, and I missed that part. But I'm glad because that's exactly what I just said.
Well, I'm not trying to distance myself. I'm simply trying to say that any reader...
Why is that the first time you've used the word Yahweh in this conversation?
I'll tell you why. Because there is a movement within
Such
the
a good
Bible
point.
itself.
Such a good point.
That you are completely missing.
Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus.
So this is Alex O'Connor just catching Dinesh D'Souza now. He's like, so this was ordained in the Old Testament. And here you're saying it's all about the New Testament, but let's listen to God himself incarnate as in the form of Jesus say that every jot and tittle, which is as it's often written, of the law is being fulfilled in Jesus. In other words, all that horrible stuff, yeah, I'm here to fulfill that. That is kosher with me.
Jesus said that in the Sermon on the Mount, referring to his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy and law.
Referring to his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy.
Old Testament law. And what I'm referring to here is an Old Testament law, which you're now trying to distance yourself from and say that it's sort of different to the New Testament.
I'm saying that
that's not what Jesus thought.
I'm saying you're missing the developmental track of the Bible that is obvious to any intelligent reader. Let me give you an example.
Okay, so that's a real insult, and I'd be really dismissive of that. I'm an intelligent reader, mate, and that's not my reading. Now, a progressive revelation is almost self-evidently bogus. And Alex O'Connor goes some way to showing this, but I think he could have taken it further. But let's watch this continue.
Let me give you one example of what I'm talking about.
Tell me about the Amalekites. Tell me what the development.
It's not about the Amalekites. It's about the way that the whole story of the Bible changes in tone and mood and message. For example,
help me out here. Like, just tell me where, any way you like. Tell me where this fits into that trajectory.
Okay, I'll tell you where.
We have just a couple minutes, guys, so let's wrap it up before the Q&A.
Just tell me.
The underlying message of the Old Testament is an eye for an eye. The Amalekites are the enemies of the Israelites. The Israelites will crush them with the same venom that the Amalekites would have crushed the Israelites. That's called an eye for an eye.
Including
now,
the children,
hold on.
The children, the infants,
the
cattle,
infants,
the sheep, the camels, the donkeys.
Yeah, that Dennis Prager says yes, but my point is different. You will not find that spirit at all in the New Testament. In fact, in the New Testament, you've got a spirit of forgiveness. So what I'm getting at is to pretend like you don't have this. Christianity is named after Christ. It's based on Christ as a fulfillment of the Old Testament. But what does fulfillment mean? It actually means transcendence. In Abraham's time, blood sacrifices are normal, right? When Christ comes as a sacrifice, Christ is the lamb. The point is, those blood sacrifices aren't necessary anymore.
Listen,
That's the Christian.
Right. So this is the nub of the whole video. And what Dinesh D'Souza is espousing here is what Justin Sheba called inter-covenantal or intercovenantal moral relativism. And that should be the hammer with which to hit Dinesh D'Souza over the head. So what he's saying is that there used to be these blood sacrifices. Jesus would come down and say, I am now the blood sacrifice, if you like, and you don't need to do that anymore. And that kind of stuff was horrible, and this is how it should be now. And so this is a progression of morality. It's a progressive revelation. So there are several things to say about this. It's like, well, why didn't you just start with that? Like, are you saying that they didn't understand this? This is one of the excuses given for slavery. It's like that humanity couldn't understand that slavery was bad back then. They needed to have these steps put in place to understand it here. No, if God just said slavery's bad, don't do it. And by the way, I'm telling you that I'm God. You might not understand it, but just don't do it. It's bad. Treat other people like you'd be treated yourself. Are you saying that people in those times couldn't understand? Well, we know that Confucius had already come out with the Golden Rule 500 years before Jesus. So actually, at that time, people could understand the notion that do unto others as you'd have done unto yourself. So it is just empirically false to say that humanity couldn't have understood the concept that slavery is bad, and they needed to wait for a progressive revelation to happen. So what this is smuggling in, what Dinesh D'Souza is smuggling in here is moral relativism, which is to say this was good for them, for those people. Like the Amalekite genocide was good, because if I say it was bad, particularly gratuitously bad, then actually that makes God a moral monster. But because God can't be a moral monster, there's somehow this has to be good. So the Old Testament has to be good because God, or Yahweh, because it's uncomfortable, I want to call him a slightly different name. God ordained this, designed this to happen, ordered it. This was all God's doing. So why is this horrible stuff ordered by God? Well, it's moral relativism. So this was right for them. The context, it was all about the context, like watching Non-Stamp Collector. It's a context. Okay. So it was good then, and then a switch was flipped at the birth of Jesus or the death of Jesus, and suddenly all that stuff is bad, and now this stuff is good, and we have a completely different set of moral evaluations and calculations and answers we're getting from those calculations. That is moral relativism. Now, Christians invariably are absolutely disgusted by moral relativism. That's what they accuse atheists of using. And you find me a Christian who espouses moral relativism as a moral value theory, then I'll be happy to change my opinion there. There will be very, very few, I'm sure. And so it is quite incredible that that's actually what Dinesh D'Souza is arguing for here. It's this idea that you've got this progression, that things were good then for those people in that time. But for these people in this time, the opposite is true. Whoa! So there isn't universal morality here. So keeping slaves is bad only in certain times. Otherwise, it's good. Okay, so genocide is only bad now, but at some point it was good. It was good before then, and then this switch happened, and then it was bad. Oh, you're in a lot of trouble, Dinesh D'Souza. This is intercovenantal, so that between the covenants, the old covenant, that was good. New covenant, that is bad. Intercovenantal moral relativism. So between these covenants, we have moral relativism.
Reading, and you keep filibustering me because you know that the Bible is showing a movement in a direction, and to miss the movement is to miss the Bible. Let's look at God in the Bible.
Hold on.
Let me make one quick point about God in the Bible.
There's nothing quick about what you're doing, Dinesh. There's nothing quick about what you're doing. I need to be allowed to respond to what you're saying. I am getting sick whenever I have these conversations.
You're cross-examining me on the justice of smiting the Amalekites. Honestly, I don't see any justice in it, but I do agree that was the eye for an eye ethic of the Old Testament that is...
Interesting, he said, I don't see any justice in it. So God ordered this, but I don't see any justice in it. So that's a real problem, Dinesh D'Souza.
Repudiated and transformed and transfigured in the new.
I've had this conversation so many times, most recently with William Lane Craig. At least he had the gall to just tell me that yes, that was a moral thing for God to do. I get sick to death of people hand waving away this genocide by some vague reference to the fact that Jesus came along to do something which somehow kind of undoes the immorality of it. Like, this is not an eye for an eye. This is a genocide of combatant men, innocent women, and children, and animals. Saul is punished by God for not killing all of the animals. Like
that is actually a ludicrous misreading of what's happening. Let me just make
a quick point. Let me just make a quick point. I have to make this point.
Okay.
I've got to read the text from Joshua as well.
Okay, and then we'll check in with the audience because we're probably. I think the audience is going to agree that we want this to keep going.
That's fine.
Instead of going to Q&A, but we'll check in just after Alex's point here.
I think it's important. Like, read these texts for yourself. There is no way that I'm misreading this text. We know that this is what's happening in the slaughter of Ai. That's a type of Canaanite. In Joshua, we're told that when Israel had finished killing all of the men in Ai, in the fields and in the wilderness, where they had chased them, and when every one of them had been put to the sword, the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. That is to say, that we're told that this is just because the promised land was inhabited, and God's God, he's allowed to do this. So because the Israelites want that land, they have to go and chase out the Ai. So they chase them into the wilderness. They chase after them. They slaughter them in the wilderness. They then turn around, come back into the city, and kill who's left. Who's left if the combatants have run away? The women and the children. This is intolerable.
And it cuts off there, but it is intolerable. And I often think about the kind of mantra that if you are twisting yourself into knots trying to justify genocide, then you're probably on the wrong side. And I say the same with slavery. So if you spend your time trying to justify why God would order both or countenance both genocide and slavery, you probably got the wrong worldview. There's something morally broken in what you believe. And at the very least, you will be assenting to intercovenantal moral relativism, which is what I think Dinesh D'Souza has to conclude or has to espouse in his thinking here, or not has to, he is. That is literally what he keeps talking about, this progression that is, and as Alex O'Connor says, that Jesus is this switch that somehow by existing, somehow all of this bad stuff that was good is now actually bad. But before it was good, and I'm the switch that makes that all happen. And it's just, no, yeah, that is, mental contortions are what you have to do in order to find that even remotely acceptable and plausible. So when he talks about reasonable, no, that is, when they both talk about that, no, that is unreasonable. You are not justified in believing that because you have not shown your reasoning to be good enough. Just punting to progressive revelation, just punting to, well, that's the narrative of the Bible. So you have to go through this horrific stuff that at the time was ordered by God. You know, with the parting of the Red Sea, that was God's magic that allowed that to happen, to kill all of those Egyptian soldiers. But remember, that's on the back of the 10 plagues that killed the firstborn. These are children, that killed the animals, all the cattle as well. You've got widespread slaughter that was done by God, and in that case it was because the Pharaoh said no, but he had his heart hardened by God. So God set up this whole situation whereby he was always going to punish these people, and he knew that anyway, there's divine foreknowledge, but he set this situation up where the Pharaoh is forced to say no. Whether God knew he was going to say yes or no is kind of irrelevant. There's no option for Pharaoh. His heart is hardened. Then God punishes the Pharaoh and the people of Egypt, you know, on behalf of the Pharaoh's forced decision, and kills him, so on and so forth. Now, if you believe this is factually true, then you have to somehow argue that this is good and right and proper. So you have some kind of moral relativism where it would not be good after the birth of Jesus or after the death of Jesus, but before the death of Jesus, somehow it's good. Or failing that, you do some kind of moral relativism, some kind of moral consequentialism, which is it's okay to kill children and animals as long as some greater good comes about, which is these people, the chosen people that went through Kadesh Barnea for 40 years and ended up in Canaan slaughtering people there. Like, if that was the greater good, then it's justified by, you know, it justifies the killing of all of these young firstborns and cattle, and so on and so forth. And that's problematic. There are no good ways of justifying the horrors of the Old Testament, which is why I think the Old Testament is the weak chink in the armor for any Christian. Like, if you are saying the Bible is true and you believe predominantly in Jesus, but Jesus came along and said, I am the fulfillment, which is why Alex O'Connor was put a lot of focus on that, because that is your connection there, and that's the weak point is the Old Testament, but it's linked to the New Testament through Jesus, who says, I am the fulfillment. Every jot and tittle of that Mosaic law, I am the fulfillment of it. You got some problems, because especially since that law is also quite abstract, like the lex talionis. So lex talionis is the eye for an eye ruling. And that is, I mean, that's why I'm writing a book on the Exodus at the moment, because it's a trilogy with my Nativity, Resurrection of Jesus, 2 books there. But these are built on the foundations of, because as Jesus said, every jot and tittle of the Exodus accounts and the Mosaic law and all the legal codes that come out of that. You've got the covenant codes, you've got the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, and Jesus is a fulfillment of that. Well, you've got lex talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, is thrown in there, and that's what Dinesh D'Souza is explaining the slaughter of the Amalekites is an example of. So the slaughter of the Amalekites is lex talionis. He says that it's an eye for an eye for a tooth and a tooth for a tooth, and Jesus is fulfilling every jot and tittle of that in his existence. You've got a problem, and Alex O'Connor was exactly right very right in a way that he exposed that. But I would just add on a little bit of moral relativism, or a bit of moral consequentialism, or some problematic thinking here and there for the Christian, for Dinesh D'Souza. Anyway, that's enough from me. Hopefully that was of interest to you. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate that, and I will speak to you soon.